Okay, so we're going to move on to our next session and topic 3 of exposures. We're going to now switch to talk with our firefighters. So this is our IAFF Metro Chiefs joint statement and PFAS and turnout gear. So it's my privilege to introduce 3 of our firefighters, one of which you already know. First is Neil McMillan, who serves as the IAFF Director of Science and Research within the Health, Safety, and Medicine Division. In his role, he collaborates with institutions and researchers across North America, and he oversees various initiatives designed to understand occupational injuries, illnesses, advocate for firefighters, and provide education to the membership, while also building partnerships with those who possess the same purpose. We're also going to welcome to the stage Dr. Danny Wu, who you met earlier this morning, as well as Chief Otto Drozd III. Dr. Drozd has 35 years of experience in fire and emergency services, including 20 years as fire chief for 4 departments in Florida and Texas. He has served as the president of the state's Fire Chiefs Association in Florida and as the vice president of the IAFC. He was only one of 3 fire chiefs over the last 30 years who has served consecutive terms as president of the Metro Chiefs. Please join me in welcoming our firefighters to the stage.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Dr. Caban-Martinez. Great to be here. We'll be talking about a joint collaborative between the IAFF and the Metro Chiefs on the issue of PFAS and PPE, specifically our turnout gear. So I'll be speaking for the first few slides and then turning it over to my colleague and supervisor, Dr. Dan Wu. So the topic of PFAS in firefighter turnout gear has been front and center in the fire service, from a local standpoint and right up through the affiliate levels to our parent organization with the IAFF. And it, invokes a lot of discussion and a lot of different feelings because we generate a certain amount of identity from things we have in the fire service, including our gear. It's been used in charity events. It's been used as well in some public relations campaigns with local representatives and elected officials. And we're trying to take a more holistic approach given some of the exposures that our gear takes from a fire scene, but also from some of the chemicals which are found in our gear. So we'd like to kind of share the message with the members that we should take a more safe approach when, considering how we use our gear and making sure it's being used as it's designed, as opposed to in other ways. So when we see some of these pictures with respects to members, exercising in gear for fitness, we're trying to provide some additional education on that. Secondary market use of gear is something we're also trying to discuss with our members. And it's having an effect because we see that stair climbs, a lot of other charity events now, these locals and members are taking a safer approach, to these type of events by not using their gear. So when it comes to PFAS in our turnout gear, why is it there? What is it doing? How do we get here? So there's a certain amount of performance requirements as per the NFPA standard, that our gear is certified to. That requires, repellency, certain amount of absorbency and penetration testing done. And for the most part, in the past, PFAS has been used to accomplish that. It's found in the outer shell. It's also found in the expanded polytetrafluoroethylene moisture barrier, the Teflon breathable moisture barrier, and also on the face cloth materials often found as part of the laminate for that moisture barrier. So there's been some studies. These have been discussed in previous symposiums and conferences, attesting to the amount of PFAS that we find in our gear. So Graham Peasley was part of that. I know some of the researchers here are familiar. They've been part of these publications, but he found high levels of PFAS, and these are mostly legacy PFAS and some precursors in our bunker gear. Found that those PFAS migrate through the different layers and that the gear sheds these PFAS. A more recent study done out of the University of Oregon by Derek Munsterman also found that there's a high level of volatile PFAS associated with our gear. So in Dr. Peasley's study, You can see he was testing different eras of gear, from 2008, 2014, 2017. And it's important to note that our gear through certain eras have used different types, manufacturers have used different types of PFAS to achieve those performance requirements. And you can see how that's changed. So for instance, if you look at some of the more newer gear from 2017, there's higher levels of PFBS. And that PFBS, has been, shown to be associated with certain health effects that are concerning for firefighters, hepatic and renal disease, as well as some immunosuppressing effects found in animal and in vitro studies. So that's a concern. In Derek Munsterman's study, and one of the co-authors, Dr. Courtney Kerrigan, has full credit for these graphics. She, put these visuals to really break down the information there with respects to the non-volatiles. And again, you can see the different eras of gear. In the 2008 gear, that light blue line is indicative of PFOA, a PFAS that's been studied heavily and known to have, absolute certain health effects, including cancer. And it's found in high concentrations in some of that older gear. However, PFOA is still being found within newer gear, new unused gear from 2019. Also, out of some of the tests done on the new unused gear, levels of PFAS were found. And those levels of PFAS, and I believe it was 3 of the 4 samples of new unused gear, exceeded what is regulated in the European Union as far as safe limits of PFAS in textiles. So that's concerning to the fire service. And it, again, helped pave the way for this joint statement between the IAFF and the Metro Chiefs. Beyond that, when evaluating the volatile PFASs, the Munsterman study showed that a lot of these replacements, and also the moisture barrier, sheds a lot of these volatiles. And some of these volatile PFAS are precursors. They've replaced other precursors. And there are some indications that those precursor PFASs, again, have terminal PFBS that result from their degradation over time. So absolutely a concern for the fire service. This is why, our members want more information. They want to have safer gear, and knowing that there's certain exposures that firefighters will receive in the course of their duties, eliminating unnecessary exposures that are found as being manufactured into our gear and PPE is something of great concern. As mentioned by Dr. Stapleton, there's been studies done on fire station dust as well. This is the Young study out of Massachusetts. And in that study, it says right there, compared to station living rooms, turnout gear locker rooms had higher dust levels of total fluorine, or higher levels of total fluorine, which is again indicative that some of these origins are coming from the textiles of our gear. Tests and studies have been done in other countries. I know McTisbury is here. There was a dust study done in Australia showing similar findings. Study Hall and all done in Canada. Again, similar findings. So it all kind of paved the way to where we are presently by having that joint statement produced to help better educate our members on the proper use of their gear. And I'll kind of leave it there and let Dr. Wu come to the stage and talk about some of the health concerns in case there's any, I guess, still outstanding questions with respects to why firefighters are concerned about PFAS.
Repeat after me. Hola. Ahora vamos a hablar de la segunda parte de esta presentación. So you guys didn't think there was going to be remedial Spanish this afternoon, huh? All right. So what have we learned? I need to learn how to work this. What have we learned from my colleague, Neil McMillan? We've learned that PFAS belongs to this scientific group of chemicals known as methyl ethyl bad stuff, right? And we've also learned that PFAS plus PFAS equals 2 bad PFAS. But not really. If you look at that effects of chemical interactions chart there on your screen, we talk about the additive effect and we talked about the antagonistic effect at the top at the bottom. But oftentimes not considered is the synergistic effect and the potentiating effect that 2 chemical interactions can exert on each other. So the synergistic effect, the additive would be PFAS plus PFAS equals 2 bad PFAS. The synergistic one would be 1 plus 1 equals 20. The potentiating one would be 0 PFAS plus another PFAS in the presence of something else. Doesn't give you 1, but gives you 10. And the antagonistic effect is a subtraction. So we see that with certain PFAS in this study, that they exert synergistic effects on a negative way. When PFAS and PFOA, two types of PFAS, are seen in very low concentrations to the tune of 500 picomolars, the mixture induced synergistic effects on breast epithelial tissue. It damaged it. While with higher concentrations, 50 micromoles, it induced cell death synergistically. So that's what this study underscores, that PFAS plus PFAS does not always equal just twice the damage. Sometimes it can be more. The toxicokinetics of the different PFAS there on the first column. So we know that PFAS is absorbed. Mainly, we're going to ingest it. So orally will account to the tune of 90% of the rate of exposure in certain studies. There is also a significant route via inhalation. And then there's limited data suggesting dermal absorption also occurs. So we can see on the column of PFAS, the different types of PFAS, and we see their half-lives. We have the short one at the very top at 3 days, 72 hours, all the way down to the middle where it says 12 years. So that's deceiving, right? Because it's half-life. So that means that it takes that long. So in the case of the ones in the middle, it's going to take 12 years to decrease the burden by 50%. But that's only as long as you don't increase that toxic burden. As long as we continue to expose ourselves with other PFAS, then the burden continues to add up, and therefore, potentially, we can have PFAS forever, because unless we stop the exposure altogether, whatever our body does to exert the half-life, it's countered by the continuous exposure of PFAS. We talked about the dermal absorption having limited data, but the limited data that exists is significant, right? The one on the right talks about dermal exposure on mouse skin models and in vitro human skin, and it's present. The one on the left is one from 2022, and that's done in an in vivo male volunteer. The results were PFOA was measured in circulation 6 hours after skin application. Absorption continues until the skin is shed approximately 3 weeks later, and shower in 48 hours post-exposure had no impact on the absorption rate. PFAS and health. The first few up on the top are all PFAS, because they all start with P, and then there's air pollution showing some compounds that are commonly found in the fire ground, which have been studied by IARC. So you can see the toxicity of the ones that are below the air pollution row. And you can see that they sporadically affect here and there. But the common theme of the PFAS is that they affect a lot of adverse health outcomes. Like I said this morning, it's a known carcinogen, immunodepressant, endocrine disruptor, teratogen, and organ toxicant. And you can see that all of those columns are represented there. And PFAS is the gift that keeps on hurting, right? On the graph on the left, there is the relationship between PFAS and testosterone, and basically it says that the more PFAS you're exposed to, the lower your testosterone level. And the one at the bottom shows that as PFAS increases, estrogen concentration increases. So it's estrogenic. That's not necessarily a good thing, right? Because estrogen can be the fuel of certain diseases, plus the imbalance that occurs between the hormones is not something that we want. And you also get to pass this gift onto your children. So we see on the graph on the right that PFAS is going to have a negative effect on the ovaries, on the uterus, the womb, on the delicate balance of hormones that needs to occur for proper reproductive function, and ultimately is going to result in possible negative birth outcomes. Which led to this. All of this information that you learned from PFAS and that I just talked about led to the IAFF reaching out to the Metro Chiefs and creating a joint statement. So the first paragraph talks about why we're doing it. The second one talks about what Neil shared with you guys about the forever chemicals being found in our bunker gear in all 3 layers. And the third one talks about something I talked about this morning, right? We're going to find alternatives. We're here, this is a good fight, and we're going to win it. We need your help, but it's going to take a while. Until then, we're going to suggest the bullets that are there, and the most important one is the one, not the most important one, but all the ones talk about do not use your gear unnecessarily. But the one at the bottom, basically, we try to sum it up is, if the risk to thermal injury exceeds the risk to the toxic exposure, then you put your bunker gear on. And with that, I'm going to hand over the control to Chief Drozd, and he'll talk about the joint statement.
Where did I go? Well, good afternoon. And for this next part of the presentation, you can put away your periodic tables and your scientific dictionary apps because you won't be needing them. So really, I want to talk about the relationship that the Metro has with the IAFF. The Metro, for those of you that don't know what that organization represents, we're a very small organization when it comes to members. We represent approximately 140 Metro departments. But the significance of that is within those 140 departments resides almost half of the IFF membership, or 150,000 firefighters. And they also provide coverage for over 100 million of the US population. So not insignificant from that perspective. Now, when we look at the coordination between the IFF and the Metro, one thing that I can say is that in almost every case that we come together yearly, we always agree on those health, safety, and wellness issues for our firefighters. And when I say almost always, we always agree on those issues. We also agree on many legislative issues. In fact, I would say that the times that we disagree are very few when we come together. And so the genesis of the statement was really for the purposes that were listed there. But the significance of when it came out, August 23rd, 2022, I'll reveal in the next slide. But certainly the purpose was to notify of the adverse health effects, talk about PFAS and its link to cancer. And it's interesting because when we put out the statement, of course, we heard from some of our member chiefs, and some were saying, well, you know, the link between PFAS and gear, is it as certain? And we've seen all the data that says it is. And while it's still in the gear, we're making every effort to get it out of the gear. And you can see some of the other purposes behind it. But really, the main purpose was to rid the fire service of occupational cancer. And that's all of our fights. Because it's not part of the job, should never be part of the job, and shouldn't be accepted. Now, as the Executive Secretary of the Metro Chiefs, I work for the NFPA. So one of the processes is looking at those existing codes and standards and making the appropriate changes within those standards in order to affect a change within our fire service. So the standards development process started some time ago with input on the first stage, and you can see where we're at today. Remember, that statement came out August 23rd of 2022. Public input opened September 6th. So really that joint statement was to raise awareness within the fire service to make sure that the change within those standards would be appropriate for the challenge that we're all facing. Now, about the NFPA standards development process, that is not driven by NFPA. In fact, NFPA staff cannot sit on any of the technical committees. NFPA staff cannot make recommendations for changes. That's done through the standards development process, where you have balanced technical committees that represent not only first responders, but others in the industry that are integral to building the appropriate PPE. Now, when we look at the current standard and where it's at, what they did recently was consolidate many of the existing standards to facilitate the process and really the coordination of these standards and the integration of these standards. So NFPA 1970 combines 1971, which is the main topic here today, protective ensembles, 1975, 81, and 82. Now, in response to the growing concerns about the hazards and the substances that firefighters were facing, that first draft made many of the changes that everybody has been advocating since the last standard was approved. Now, here we can see some of the changes that are already in the first draft of the standard, and then these will be followed up by the public comment that will be acted upon by the technical committee. So just going through some of them, looking at the elimination of degradation testing and using samples to test. One of the downfalls of testing gear in the past was they were destructive tests to the gear. So now in the new standard, there will be samples available that have been in contact with all the same atmospheres that our firefighters have been in, and they could test those samples or those swatches instead of being destructive to the gear. And then there's going to be, for the manufacturers, there's going to be a PFAS-free gear. If you see in the recommendations, it says, well, we're going to limit the use of our gear for those appropriate times until we have PFAS-free gear. So there's already, within the new language, a PFAS-free provision. And some of the other ones, ease of testing, requirements for penetration resistance of contaminants, and some of the others that you see there. Now, I'm new to NFPA, having been 35 years in the fire service, 21 as fire chief, so when they sent me this slide, I had to, I called the guy that sent it to me, and his name is Barry, and I go, Barry, you're gonna have to explain this thing to me because we're talking a different language right now. So I'm going to try and translate for you. No lo voy a hacer en español, pero lo puedo hacer así también. Dr. Wu. So public comment on the first draft ended, it was September 6th through January 4th. 178 comments came in on the consolidated standard. What will happen is that will go to the second draft technical committee, and I can tell you NFPA has responded by adding more meetings for the second draft so that all of the public comment can be addressed, and so that people can participate either in person or virtually within these meetings, so that everybody can be heard from. Now, once the technical committee makes a decision on each one of those public comments, then it would go to the second draft for the correlating committee, which would look at consistency not only within each portion of the existing standard, but across other standards as well. Then that would go to the second draft report. But that's not the end. There's still an opportunity from there if some of the things that were put forward in public comment weren't acted upon, then there's the opportunity to do a notice of intent to make a motion. And that would be up to November 1st, and then it would be certified, and it would go to the annual meeting to be voted on by the membership, and then the vote on the membership would go to the technical committee, and they would either accept or reject some of the changes, and then it would go to final issuance in January of 2024. Now, when we look at the total public comments that came in just on this topic, 178 came in. 112 of those were related to the topic of the discussion today, PFAS in gear, and its impact on firefighters. And you can see how it's broken down within the different chapters there. With testing getting the most of those, because it's not only looking for PFAS, but those other types of hazardous chemicals that could be impacting our firefighters. Now, when we look at the joint statement and you look at each of these, and we can take them one at a time, these are just common sense recommendations that we've talked about for years in the fire service. Turnout gear shouldn't be worn into firehouse living areas. We haven't been doing that for a long time. Common sense recommendation. When transporting gear, pack it away. When we were talking about gross decon and the impact of gear, we've been talking about this for years already. Apparatus cabs should be clean. A lot of departments have gone to clean cabs, so this isn't groundbreaking, but it's reiterating. Wash hands, common sense. Legacy gear should be replaced once you get PFAS-free gear. I think we can all get behind that. And don't wear turnout gear on responses where the level of protection is not necessary until you get that PFAS-free gear. And you know, this really leads to the next presentation that we'll talk about how this is being implemented across departments, because there have been recommendations on how to implement each one of these, but again, they're all based on common sense recommendations that each one of our member departments, each one of our firefighters should be taking to protect their health and the health of their brothers and sisters. Thank you.
Okay, so why don't we open it up for some questions from both online and from here in the room? Any questions? Okay, we'll start up here in the front. Just keep your hand raised and a microphone will be brought to you. They're going to hustle. Unless you can project really loud.
I can project pretty loud.
Okay, go for it.
So my question is, to all the panel, old bunker gear, is there gonna be an effort to collect old gear? So for example, if you say lot 106 or lot 208, for a database, or just a few thoughts of the
Well, there's a couple of things with that. With the recommendations, we're saying don't wear the gear if you don't have to. And the reason it's not saying get rid of the gear because there's nothing to replace it with. But as you have PFAS-free gear come onto the market, then the expectation would be that some of the legacy gear would start making its way out of the system. But it would be, you know, a lot of the gear has a 10-year life cycle, so it's going to take some time to get that legacy gear out of the system, but we're hopeful with the changes that are being discussed here, with some of the changes within the standard, that we'll see that occur at an expedited rate.
Great answer, but my question is, as far as like what the IFF is doing with the potential lawsuit, do they need old gear for testing?
Yeah, can you guys repeat the question before you say it?
There's a mic behind you, Doug, if you want to repeat the question.
Okay, thank you. The question is that as we build a database of PFAS, different manufacturers, et cetera, is the IFF possibly going to be collecting older gear? So, you know, if we're able to track different types of PFAS, or that isn't important?
It's not that it's not important. I don't know that it's an effort that we're doing right now. I haven't heard that we're going to be collecting a database of bunker gear at the IAFF level, nor have I learned or heard that we're going to file lawsuits. So what we have done is the IAFF, in an effort, what I spoke about this morning, is we've retained 3 law firms. And these are the clearinghouses and the hubs that are receptioning the information from our members and are guiding them in the process. We are involved because we are the IAFF, but to date, there is no information about any forthcoming litigation.
And I'll add to that, with respect to knowing what you have in your gear and again, the different generations, it's really important for locals to know how your RFPs have changed over time, maybe ask to have language included so any finishes and coatings applied to each layer of the gear is also listed on labeling so you can track that. And then moving forward, you know, it's expensive to replace gear and it's going to be a real financial burden for a lot of departments. So working with, you know, local and state legislators to either have buyback or take back programs, because when PFAS is contaminated, like in a water source, you know, a super fund, you know, is developed in time. We don't have that. And for end of use concerns with respect to our gear and the high cost, those are things that need to be discussed with elected officials that can, you know, pull those purse strings.
Thank you. Any other questions? I'm going to jump over here.
Yeah.
So, thank you so much for all
Oh,
your
sorry.
work you're doing. One of the things I want to ask is there an effort to provide volunteer firefighters with gears without the PFAS? That's one. The second question is there a plan and how do you dispose of the gears with PFAS?
Well, as discussed, presently, the concern about secondary market, you know, is real. I know that anecdotally, when Dr. Peasley speaks about it, his first interest is what do firefighters do with their gear? He finds it to be the most fluorinated textile, and, you know, he doesn't want to see it in landfills contaminating water sources. With respect to the volunteer community, you know, I can't speak to that, but I know that any of the legislation and lobbying efforts put forth by the IFF, again, either at the local, state, or national level, will hopefully benefit all firefighters. And with that in mind, you know, we want to ensure that, you know, these types of contaminants aren't within communities, whether they're in the homes we go into, in the gear we wear, or anywhere else.
It's actually, if I have a point of privilege for a second, it's actually an interesting question from the perspective that sometimes gear from the U.S. is donated to other countries that are in low resource settings. So when we worked with firefighters, say in Latin America or in the Caribbean, that they have, you know, American uniforms that are reused there. So I wonder if we should talk a little bit about how we can do that and preserve that, not to transfer it there. Other questions? Cheryl?
Yeah.
Or Neil, I'm sorry. Go for it. Sorry.
Dr. Caban, thank you. So I just want to confirm what was said, that no gear currently is PFAS free. The moisture barrier has PFAS, period, correct?
That's correct. There's some offerings presently, and they're only new offerings where durable water repellent finishes are either wax or silicone based instead of fluorine based. So again, knowing how much gear costs, you know, most locals, most departments, if you look at the data, it was purchased, unless it was purchased in the last year, in all likelihood, even the durable water repellent finishes on the outer shells have, you know, PFAS in it. But presently, every moisture barrier on the market is the EPFE, and with the exception, I think, of one kind of brand offering the face cloth materials as well are treated. And what was found, again, with the Munsterman study is that, you know, some of this new gear is shedding volatiles, and they believe the origin of those volatiles are the moisture barrier.
So I have a follow-up. So the Munster and the Peasley studies both show in those testing of those gears were not any of them that claimed they were PFAS free or didn't have it on those outer linings, correct? Because this is really the heart of my question is, in the fire service, we're you know, 100 years of tradition unimpeded by progress, right? So with the culture that is here, and firefighters, they love their gear, they want to be fit, they want to work hardened, they want to have resiliency, they are doing workouts in this gear. We're going to turn around and be the alarmist, correct, and say, hey, you can't wear your gear except on an emergency call, and not any emergency call, one that you need thermal protection on. That's the recommendation that we're giving. That's what we're going to go with. What solutions, because I'm sitting here racking my brain going, what solutions can I provide to my team for that? You know, has anyone in this room worked out how are we going to tackle this? Because it's going to be at least 2 to 3 years.
Yes, 100%. So we've been on this journey in Australia for 15 years. So we've tackled we don't use any PFAS containing firefighting foam because that's your number one exposure pathway. Because you ingest it, you're absorbing it, you're getting through your mucous membranes in the eyes. The second one is that culture you're talking about. We do not wear our PPE is there to protect us from fires. It's not there as a fancy dress costume. Now, we're proud to be firefighters, so when we do publicity events now, we have imitation turnout gear. So it's not the fair income stuff, but it looks, the public think we look like firefighters. You know, we are firefighters, but we have kids' uniforms made up, small ones, with non-PFAS containing materials. So you can still look like a firefighter, but our gear is there to protect us from fires. It's not a fancy dress uniform. We know our firefighter, and just one other thing. When you get people push back saying, well, this is our culture, this is what we do, tell them to go to one of our funerals. Let's stop burying our friends. Let's stop burying our colleagues just because we want to look. Yeah. Thank you.
And in my experience, right, it's rather simple to reason with a firefighter because they're only bothered by two things: the way things are and change. So it's really on us, this group, and then the other groups. It goes right back to my talk this morning. You know, we don't work in a vacuum. We're not in a silo. It's going to take a while. Like Neil said, today, as of this moment, there is no PFAS-free bunker gear. It doesn't matter what the vendor tells you. There is no PFAS-free right now in the market as of right now. So it's going to take a while. It's going to take a culture change. It's going to take people realizing that, you know what? I don't need to have my helmet all suited up. I don't need to have my bunker gear all dirtied up. I don't need to have my lieutenant sleeping in quarters on bunker gear because it's cool. It was when we were on the job, no longer. And I'm glad to see that.
And I'll add to that. I mean, when I came up through the fire service, the people I looked up to that could do the job, you know, these leather-lung smoke eaters, you know, played either professional, semi-professional sports. They didn't really work out at work. And we got this fitness culture and people were working out. And then Instagram came along, and those workouts went from the station gym to the apparatus floor for the pictures in front of the fire trucks. But I wouldn't pay for a gym membership in a gym where people are running diesel apparatus and are, you know, washing dog feces off a hose. So it's not acceptable for us to be doing that in the stations as well. And seeing everybody's hands put up when speaking about, you know, whether, you know, we've been touched by a firefighter, you know, who's had cancer, that's enough reason, you know, in of itself. I mean, you know, go to some of these cancer wards, talk to the widows, you know, and ask them whether, you know, we should be going grocery shopping in our gear and the rest of it. I mean, the unfortunate reality is these chemicals are, you know, causing cancer. They surely contributed to cancer in a lot of firefighters, and I think that's reason enough to try to, you know, push this culture of safety. I mean, when it comes to culture in the fire service, it's not about changing it. You know, we develop, you know, security from our culture. It's a place to thrive, but incorporating those values into our culture that we already hold dear, like safety and like looking after each other. So that's kind of the perspective that I'm hoping that, you know, a lot of the members will adopt.
All right, we'll take one more question. Cheryl?
In my research rabbit holes that I've gone down on this subject in the last 5 or 6 years, I've learned that industry went to court and fought to not put warning labels on our gear because they knew it was in it, and they won that, so we never were warned about it. And I've also learned that then when it came out that it was in our gear, they initially tried to deny it in a formal letter, and then they had to recant that in another formal letter that said it was in our gear, but it was trace amounts that wouldn't cause harm. So forgive me for not trusting industry. My question to you as a panel is, how are we going to assure moving forward that the cure doesn't become worse than the disease? They have to put something in our gear to keep us safe, obviously. What is that replacement going to be? What is it going to look like? And how are we going to assure it's actually going to be safe for us?
Well, that's a great question, and part of the standard is that it has to have certain characteristics within the gear. So they're going to have to come with an alternative in order to get that PFAS-free label. But in the process of doing that, it's still going to have to meet some of the quality standards that already exist within that standard. Now, you know, and I wanted to go back a second because, you know, the question was asked, how do we stop being the alarmists on this. I don't think it's about being the alarmist. This is our reality. We have this issue. It could impact the lives of our firefighters. And that's why when a lot of times you may see differences between labor and management, in this case, we're unified because it is affecting the health, wellness, and safety of all of our firefighters. And again, that's a fight worth having. And that's a culture worth changing if it saves even one life.
And certainly a discussion to keep going. Ahora en español. So we're just out of time. We're going to keep the schedule going. So please join me in thanking our firefighters for that very, very interesting discussion.